Today we are going to explore some real-life horror stories that occurred on cold winter nights. I'm sure these stories will keep you up at night and make your heart race. So grab a cup of hot cocoa, put on your warmest sweater, and get ready for some chilling tales. The first story takes place in a small town in the Midwest during the winter of 1980. It was late one evening when an eerie fog began rolling in from the nearby lake. As the fog thickened, people began to report seeing strange figures moving through it. Some described them as humanoid shapes with glowing eyes, while others reported hearing mysterious voices coming from the fog. People were terrified by what they saw and heard, and soon enough news of this phenomenon had spread throughout the town. The fog was so thick that it seemed to swallow up the town, and the locals felt like it was a living creature, moving and breathing, with a will of its own. People began to whisper about a strange force that seemed to be behind it all, and soon enough, the stories of what had happened on that foggy night were passed down from one generation to the next. Even now, people in the town still talk about what they saw that night. Some claim that they heard strange noises coming from the fog, like whispers and distant laughter. Others swear that they saw glowing eyes peering out of the fog and that they could feel some sort of malevolent presence in the air. Whatever the case may be, one thing is for sure: something mysterious and sinister happened on that cold winter night in 1980. That night, the townspeople were filled with a sense of dread and fear that they had never experienced before. They stayed in their homes, some of them even barring the windows and doors in an attempt to keep out whatever force was lurking in the fog. As the night wore on, the fog began to dissipate and the townspeople felt a sense of relief. But they were still on edge, knowing that whatever had been out there was still out there somewhere. In the days following the incident, a lot of people started to speculate about what had happened. Some said it was supernatural, others said it was the work of some kind of evil entity. Whatever the case may be, it was clear that something had disturbed the peace of the small town on that cold winter night. People began to talk about the strange phenomenon, and the stories and rumors kept growing. Some people said that the fog was tied to a darker presence, one that had been dormant in the town for years but had suddenly awoken. Others pointed to the nearby lake as the source of the mysterious fog, and some even said that the old woman who was found dead had somehow been connected to the whole thing. No one knew for sure what had happened that night, but the townspeople were sure of one thing: something sinister was afoot and they needed to be on their guard. As the weeks and months went by, the townspeople continued to tell and retell the stories of what had happened that night, always warning each other to be careful and keep an eye out for whatever was lurking in the fog. The next morning, all of the reports stopped abruptly when a body was discovered at the edge of town near where most of the sightings had occurred. The body belonged to an elderly woman who had been missing for weeks, and no one could explain how she ended up where she did or why her eyes were glowing like those reported in the foggy figures seen earlier that night. To this day, no one knows what really happened that night or who or what was behind it all. Our second story takes us to a small rural village in Russia during a particularly harsh winter season in 2008. It was late one night when villagers started noticing lights flickering around their homes and strange noises coming from outside their windows. This went on for several weeks until eventually people began disappearing from their homes without any explanation or trace left behind. Fearing for their lives, the villagers took to barricading their windows and doors every night, wary of what or who could come for them. Still, reports of strange figures and sightings continued coming in from all over town, leading to a heightened sense of fear and paranoia among the community. Everyone was on edge, and the mood of the village was eerily tense as the weeks passed by. To make matters worse, the fog that had been present all winter only seemed to get thicker and more oppressive the longer the mysterious figure continued to lurk in the shadows. The reports kept coming in and people started to feel like they were being watched at all times. People started to whisper amongst themselves about a mysterious figure seen wearing an old fur coat, and eventually, the figure became the source of fear and panic in the village. Even though the figure was never seen in broad daylight, villagers would wake up to find their doors unlocked and their windows open, with no signs of forced entry. Even the bravest of the villagers were wary of venturing out, as the fog seemed to thicken with every passing day, and the sightings of the figure were becoming increasingly frequent. The village had been living in fear for weeks now, and the villagers were desperate for answers. They pooled their resources and organized a search party to look for the mysterious figure. Unfortunately, all of their efforts were in vain. No one could find any trace of the figure, and the reports of strange lights and noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The villagers were just beginning to think that the nightmare was over when a body was discovered at the edge of the town. It was an elderly woman who had been missing for weeks, and her eyes were glowing in the same way as those reported in the sightings of the figure. To this day, no one knows what really happened that night or who or what was behind it all. The villagers knew that they had to take action and figure out what was going on. They decided to form a search party and comb through the town in search of the mysterious figure. Everyone was on high alert, but the search party was unsuccessful, and no trace of the figure was found. To make matters worse, the fog seemed to thicken with every passing day, and reports of strange lights and noises only increased. People started to whisper amongst themselves that the figure was always seen in the same fur coat, and it became the source of much fear and anxiety. Despite their best efforts, no one could explain why the figure was always seen late at night and why it seemed intent on kidnapping anyone who got too close. The villagers were desperate for answers, so they pooled their resources to try and find out what was going on. But all of their efforts were in vain, as the reports and sightings of the figure stopped abruptly when a body was discovered at the edge of town. It was an elderly woman who had been missing for weeks, and her eyes were glowing just like those reported in the sightings of the figure. The villagers were deeply shaken, and rumors started to spread that the figure had something to do with the woman's disappearance and death. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved, and the villagers still don't know what happened that night or who or what was behind it all. The only clue left behind was the mysterious figure wearing an old fur coat, and it left the village in a state of fear and paranoia. The fog that had been present all winter seemed to have taken on a life of its own, and the villagers were left to wonder what secrets it was hiding. The only clue left behind was a mysterious figure wearing an old fur coat spotted walking around town late at night by those brave enough to venture out after dark. Eventually it became clear that whatever this figure was, it seemed intent on kidnapping anyone who came too close for comfort. The search party was unsuccessful in finding any trace of the mysterious figure, and the reports of strange lights and noises stopped soon after. To make matters worse, the fog that had been present all winter seemed to be getting thicker and more oppressive. People started to whisper amongst themselves that the figure was always seen in the same fur coat, and it was the source of much fear and paranoia in the village. Everyone was on high alert, and the mood of the village was eerily tense as the weeks passed by. The villagers started to become desperate for answers and decided to pool their resources to try and find out what was going on. They searched high and low, but still could not find any trace of the figure. All of their efforts were in vain, and their search remained fruitless. But then, one day, a body was discovered at the edge of town. It was an elderly woman who had been missing for weeks, and her eyes were glowing in the same way as those reported in the sightings of the figure. The villagers were deeply shaken, and rumors started to spread that the figure had something to do with the woman's disappearance and death. To this day, no one knows what really happened that night or who or what was behind it all. The only clue left behind was the mysterious figure wearing an old fur coat, and it left the village in a state of fear and paranoia. The fog that had been present all winter seemed to have taken on a life of its own, and it was no longer a natural occurrence. It felt as though the fog was hiding something, some secret that the villagers felt was not meant to be discovered. Everyone was on edge, and it seemed as though the mystery would remain unsolved forever. People started to lose hope as to ever finding out the truth about what happened that night, and the village was left to wonder what secrets the fog was hiding. These 3 true horror stories have been around for years, but still remain unsolved mysteries that haunt us even today as we try to make sense of them all. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll finally find out what really happened each time these spooky occurrences took place.